You can't discuss assimilation without first discussing how the culture of both state-sponsored and societal bigotry towards Muslims has really marginalized.
What'd they do?
You know, the 5 to 10 million Muslims in France. They did a range of things. They passed the 2004 headscarf ban, the 2010 niqab ban. You know, considerable legislation. Even before then, that really stigmatized and marginalized Muslims in France.
How are the French people, before I go back to Brigitte, supposed to get these Muslims to assimilate into their country, to become Frenchmen as opposed to Muslims?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to view French assimilation as being considerably distinct from American assimilation, right? In the France model, they essentially pose an ultimatum. You're either French or Muslim. There's no hybridized, hyphenated identities like we have here in the States. And that's a difficult decision for anybody, right? I mean, individuals latch onto the religions and their faiths really tightly. Another note is that we talk about the freedom of expression, but there's no free exercise of religion in France, especially for Muslims. So these are core principles, I think, that can be eliminated from the discourse.
Brigitte, is that true?
Absolutely not true. I mean, look, there are so many different people from different cultures and different religions that immigrate to France and to different countries around the world. How come they assimilate? I mean, I can tell you from my own country of Lebanon, millions of people fled and they settled in France and they assimilated into French culture. French culture is open-minded. They are tolerant just like any other Western culture. The problem is with Islamic immigration, no matter where they go, whether Australia, America, Canada, Europe, they are not assimilating, and to the contrary, the second generation is even becoming more radical than the first generation. So this is a problem coming from the Islamic culture itself and their ideology, and has nothing to do with the nonsense Islamophobia that Arab pundits come on television and give us. And it's time to throw political correctness in the garbage where it belongs and start calling a spade a spade.
So since you're in college and you're thinking of the big things, the big ideas here, you're upset that there are undocumented students, as you say, on your campus, and you don't think President-elect Trump is sympathetic enough to them. So let's sort of pull back a little bit. Who do you think has a right to come to this country? You apparently assume that these people have a right to be on your campus taking a state-subsidized education. Who has a right to come to the United States?
I believe that everyone should be able to come to the United States. We are always and have been and are still a nation of immigrants. And so I believe that, you know, there is no line. We can let in as many people as we choose in terms of policy. And it's, you know, there's artificial limits set on who can come in, who can't, from what countries and from what countries can't,
right,
whether they're skilled or not. And I feel like that is abandoning our heritage as a nation of immigrants.
So anybody who wants to come should come. Now, most of those people who do come, the low-skilled ones, are a net cost to taxpayers. They take more in services than they produce. Gotcha, bitch. You know the supply and you know the basic economic laws. So you believe then that taxpayers have a moral obligation to subsidize anybody who wants to come here?
I'm not sure where you're getting those figures from. I've heard different figures. Okay. I've heard studies that say that undocumented immigrants actually provide a net benefit to the economy. Okay. And a lot of these studies that claim that undocumented immigrants are a drain or you know, taking money away from taxpayers or something like that are using kind of biased
yeah. Well, you heard wrong, because it's
like
it's not even close between education and infrastructure and health care, food subsidies, housing subsidies. It's literally not even close. Mm-hmm. But the point is, do you consider the effect this has on the rest of the population? You say anybody around the world has a right to come here. You learned that in school and you believe it uncritically. Do you think that everyone else who lives in this country has a right to say, wait a second, we should be able to choose who comes here?
So we shouldn't forget that we're talking about a president-elect
right,
that has pledged to deport 11 million people from this country. And so that's what I would like to keep the focus on, is the tremendous human rights violation that would entail. A deportation force rounding up people who are undocumented, people who have been here for their entire lives, almost. People, you know, we had a person at our rally today who was, you know, who was brought here at 3 months old. And he's, you know, he's undocumented, but he's an American. He deserves to be here. And, you know,
I get it. No, I've heard it before. Alex, do you think people have a right to lock their doors? Or do you think they have an obligation to let anyone in who chooses to come? Well, you're saying that the United States has no right to prevent people who want to come here from coming here. And I'm just asking you, does the same apply to us as individuals? Do you have a right to keep people out who want to share your apartment with you?
I think that's not really a direct analogy. That obviously a nation state, a sovereign nation state, is very different from an individual.
Well, it belongs to its citizens, so they should be able to decide who comes in or out. Wouldn't you agree?
Gotcha, bitch.
Doesn't the country belong to its citizens?
I think.
Hi. Fact number 1. Transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychologists Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number 2. Rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor. Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where your
is there a question mark
life
at
you
the
end
end?
up. Fact number 3, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the 3 facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
You say that you believe many people in America believe in your definition of freedom from coercion. And I might agree with you, but I also believe that many people in America believe in a different kind of freedom, and that is freedom to well-being, a certain level of standards, fair housing, at a good price, education, etc. The other thing I want to say is that the system has built into it the poor remain poor and the rich remain rich, and that is an externality of the system.
It is not built into the system at all. It has never been true. It's simply a false. If you look at the evidence, there is an enormous amount of mobility from one class to the other. In fact, there used to be a saying, 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, which reflected exactly the opposite effect. So it simply is not built into the system. On the contrary, there's a great deal of mobility within generations and between generations, and we shouldn't argue on the basis of false factual premises.
That mobility, well, let me continue because I'm not sure it really has an effect on the question. Because it is not immediately easy to become in the wealthy class. There are certain parts of the system which make that virtually impossible for the real person. Now, I believe that this freedom too represents the belief in equality. as opposed to liberty. And I wonder, is it possible to build a system based on this equality, which I believe that many people agree in, and would not be willing to sacrifice to the liberty of freedom from?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give a full answer to your question because you've asked a very, very complex question, and so you're going to have to pardon me if I am a little dogmatic. But I only want to suggest that the statements I'm making are not without some thought and reason behind them. In my opinion, a society that aims for equality before liberty will end up with neither equality nor liberty.
Another one.
Well, the problem is twofold here. One is what's actually being taught in certain ethnic studies classes, which tends to be on a myopic focus on the idea that America is a racist place against certain ethnicities and minorities. The second point here is just the giant waste of taxpayer dollars that this constitutes. Look, I took Jewish studies courses when I was at UCLA. There are only two reasons that you take a Jewish studies course. The first is to meet girls, and the second is to get an easy A. And that's why most students are taking ethnic studies courses unless they're buying into this radical ideology that really is the basis of all ethnic studies courses throughout America.
Interesting. I had no idea that that was secretly the purpose behind the Jewish studies courses.
I didn't either.
I got bitches, 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 I got bitches.
Explains a lot about the makeup of some of those classes back at my school. Let me ask you this, Professor Charles. I understand wanting to, there may be ethnic studies classes that are legit, and you know those are pretty common. But in this class, this professor Curtis Acosta was using texts that talk about occupied America, that talk about white people being gringos, talk about, as they said, Benjamin Franklin, who is a racist, and on, and it seems like they were stirring up anti-race sentiments.
I think that's certainly one way to interpret that. I take some offense at the idea that ethnic studies courses are designed entirely to stir up anti-American sentiment, because that suggests that the people who take those courses don't feel any kind of attachment to the United States, which just isn't true. I think that
shouldn't be the suggestion, obviously. The suggestion is that anti-American courses...
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. So I think that the things that you mentioned in terms of the racial attitudes of Benjamin Franklin, or the fact that there was a time in our history where parts of what is now the United States were actually Mexico, that people of African descent, of Latin American descent, of Native American descent were exploited and oppressed at a point in our history. I think those are all factually accurate.
But that's not exactly...
And I think that to move us toward...
Let me just interrupt you just to keep the debate going, because that is less controversial the way you just phrased it than what was actually happening. I mean, referring to white people as gringos, let's start there. Is that appropriate? What if these texts referred to black people by the N-word?
Well, there are texts you read in college that do refer to blacks as the N-word, because we read Huck Finn. We read other works of literature that use those phrases. I'm saying that there is a place for doing those things, if, depending on the context. I do not believe that these courses are intended, or that this particular professor's intention is to stir up anti-American sentiment. So what I see here in terms of...
All right, hold on. I got to give both parties in, so let me give it back to Ben and ask you, Ben, to respond.
Yes, context matters, and ethnic studies courses are based on the basic idea of critical studies. Critical studies is a notion that the typical history doesn't include enough about particular races, and therefore we have to break it down by race. So there's black history, and there's Jewish history, and there's gay history, and there's Latino history. What is anti-American about that in general, as just a general matter, is the idea that America is not a melting pot with a similar set of ideas that undergirds all of Americanism. And that is what is so disturbing about all of these courses.
I do agree that there is stigma that I have to deal with because I am fat, but I'm actually really in celebration of my body. I find beauty in diversity. I think we come in all shapes and sizes. And the assumption that we've dealt with a lot on this show is that just because you're obese, you must overeat. You must have an eating disorder. I know that not to be the case. I know you can have a healthy relationship.
Now, Mimi, you say this is misleading. Go have at it a little bit.
Well, I certainly think that we all want to feel good about ourselves. That's understandable. I don't think people should feel demeaned by their size. And I also couldn't agree more with the message of daily exercise. No matter what size you are, you'll certainly benefit from daily exercise. You can't be healthy without that. But then let's talk about where we disagree. Look, if you want to feel good about yourself, it's impossible to feel good about yourself when you're doing something that's self-destructive. Also, self-destructive behaviors that result in damage or debilitation or even disfigurement to the body, that's never going to be perceived as beautiful.
The thing is that I think that the Hayes approach, the health at every size approach, has been documented to work. And it's been documented to work year after year.
What do you mean work? What do you mean work? Because a health at every size is a lie. If you starve yourself into damage, that's unhealthy. Or if you eat yourself into damage, that's not healthy.
You're making a lot of assumptions.
That's just not.
Here,
that's not true.
You're making a lot of assumptions.
That's like saying
about
that.
Weight
let's
being
say you were a smoker. Let's say you're a smoker and have black lungs, and you try to say that's healthy because you don't have cancer yet. We know that it is actually factual that obesity is dangerous, and it's connected to cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's. We even know it's connected to an increase in birth defects. So there's nothing left to debate.
Mimi?
It's not beautiful. It's not healthy.
I think you need to separate the idea of weight from healthy behavior. Yes. Now, I have students that when they come to me, when they start my class, they can barely walk from the car to my class. And over the course of a year, I'll take them from that point to working out 3+ hours
There's
per
your class
week.
now.
Right.
I mean, but that's a massive improvement. I mean,
Right.
that's no longer people with medical issues. Those are people you've taken and improved them.
But they haven't necessarily lost a lot of weight. Some of them have lost no weight, and they've had these medical improvements, and they've had these life improvements, these life freedom improvements, without losing weight.